reporting. Species Act, sports, Species Act, sports, service, Species Act, sports, Species Act, sports, Species Act, species, service, species, service, species.
Wyoming, species,
Sports, Species Act, at
sports, service, species act, service, species, Wyoming, species act, service, species act, service, species act,
sports,
service,
Species Act,
Species Act,
Wyoming,
Species Act, Species Act, Service, Species Act, Species Act, Species Service, Species Service, Species Act, Service, Species